I didn't understand that the moment would follow me for years until I felt her thumb press lightly beneath my chin, not forceful, not tender either, just steady enough to say, "Stay here," and in that pause between breath and movement I realized something irreversible was about to happen, whether or not any pain ever touched my mouth. She was laughing then, not cruelly, but with the loose, unguarded ease that alcohol gives her when the edges of the world soften and she forgets to protect herself from irony. The kitchen light was too bright for the hour, a single bulb humming faintly overhead, illuminating the clutter we never quite finished dealing with, mail stacked near the counter, a chipped mug drying upside down, a smear of something red on the cutting board that I would later realize was beet juice. None of it felt staged. That was the problem. It all felt painfully ordinary. I remember thinking, absurdly, that if something important was about to happen, the room should look different. There should have been shadows or music or some kind of warning. Instead there was just her, barefoot, swaying slightly, holding a tube of lipstick she had dug out of a drawer we rarely opened anymore, a color I didn't recognize as hers. Too dark, maybe. Or maybe just unfamiliar in this context, in her hand, pointed vaguely in my direction. "You don't have to," she said, which I understood immediately as a test rather than a reassurance. That was where the real decision happened, not when she lifted the lipstick, not when she leaned closer, but in the half-second where I could have laughed it off, turned away, made a joke, reasserted the version of myself that had worked well enough for decades. I had practiced that version extensively. I knew its lines. I knew its exits. Instead, I stayed still. It's important, I think, to say that nothing about that choice felt brave in the cinematic sense. There was no swelling courage, no clarity. It felt more like fatigue, like I had grown tired of maintaining a certain internal posture, holding my shoulders a particular way inside my own mind. I didn't think, "This is who I am." I thought, "I don't want to lie for the next 10 minutes. Her thumb was warm. That surprised me. I'd always imagined moments of rupture as cold things, sharp and clean. This was neither. Her skin smelled faintly of dish soap and wine, the everyday sense of our shared life, and that familiarity made it harder to pretend this was a joke drifting safely toward morning amnesia. When the lipstick touched my mouth, I felt an immediate, almost clinical awareness of myself, of the shape of my lips, the way they moved, the tension in my jaw as I tried not to flinch. I wasn't thinking about how it looked. I was thinking about how exposed I felt, how suddenly visible parts of me were that I had kept abstract even to myself. She frowned in concentration, her laughter subsiding into something quieter, more focused. The room seemed to contract around us, not dramatically, but in the way attention narrows when something matters more than you expected it to. I could hear the refrigerator cycle on. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear the tiny, soft scrape of the lipstick against skin, a sound I had no previous memory for and no immediate place to store. What unsettled me most was not fear of being seen, but the realization that I had been seen all along in a way I had never acknowledged. This wasn't her imposing something on me. This was her responding to something I had never given language to, something that had lived in the negative space of our conversations, in jokes half made and quickly abandoned, in the careful way I had always redirected curiosity away from myself. I want to be honest here, there was no rush of euphoria. There was no sudden sense of alignment. What I felt was responsibility. A quiet, heavy understanding that by allowing this small, visible act, I was agreeing, however implicitly, to a reckoning I could not later pretend had been accidental. She stepped back when she was done, squinting slightly, as if evaluating a piece of art she didn't remember starting. Her expression softened, not into desire, not into mockery, but into something closer to concern. "Huh," she said. "That's different." Different is a word that can open doors or close them, depending on who's holding it. In that moment, I realized I had spent most of my life trying to make sure it was never applied to me. I looked at my reflection in the darkened microwave door, not clearly, not dramatically. Just enough to confirm that something external now matched an internal tension I had carried without admitting it was there. The color wasn't the point. The visibility was. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know what this would ask of my marriage, my sense of self, my moral obligations to honesty and care. What I knew was that something quiet and consequential had begun, and that whatever meaning it would eventually hold would depend less on appearances and more on how I chose to act from this moment forward. I turned back to her, feeling older somehow, and said the only truthful thing I could manage. "We should talk about this when you're sober." She nodded, serious now, and in that nod was the first hint that this wasn't a story about a night or a joke or a costume, but about the slow, often uncomfortable work of becoming someone who could live without hiding from himself, or from the people he loved. The morning after, the world felt heavier in a way I didn't understand at first. I woke with the faint taste of yesterday's wine still clinging to the edges of memory, and the house was silent except for the hum of the heater and the occasional scrape of a neighbor's garbage being collected. Sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, painting the floor in dusty stripes, and I noticed immediately that something about me had shifted, though it wasn't in my clothes or even in the lingering smear of lipstick I had carefully wiped away in the bathroom mirror. It was inside, like the quiet expansion of a room I didn't realize had walls. She was still asleep on the couch, the blanket drawn up to her chin, and for a moment I hesitated, standing there in the doorway. Part of me wanted to retreat back into the self I had rehearsed all my life, the one that stayed small, polite, invisible in the spaces I didn't fully inhabit. Part of me wanted to sit down beside her and talk, to explore the strange intimacy of a hand steadying a chin and a brush tracing lines that had nothing to do with performance or desire, and everything to do with recognition. I made coffee, not really awake, letting the aroma fill the kitchen while I stared at the counter. My reflection caught in the stainless steel of the kettle, a shadowed, unfinished version of myself, and I realized that I could no longer think about who I was without thinking about what I had allowed her to do. That small act, the brushing of color across my lips, had been like a pinprick in a balloon I had been inflating with years of habitual denial. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't public. But it was irreversible in a way I was only beginning to understand. I remembered the look in her eyes as she stepped back the night before. There had been no triumph, no teasing, only focus and a quiet, almost impatient patience. It struck me later that she had probably known me better than I knew myself. Not in some all-knowing, mystical way, but in the painfully ordinary ways, noticing the small tensions in my posture, the habitual avoidance of mirrors, the jokes I made to deflect curiosity. She saw the gaps I hadn't filled, the questions I hadn't asked, and she had acted without malice, without expectation, simply responding to something that had been there all along. That day was a slow unraveling. I couldn't work, couldn't focus. Emails blurred, the calendar on my phone felt intrusive. Every reflection, window, car mirror, shiny surface, caught me in a new frame, and I realized I was studying myself with a mix of curiosity and unease that I hadn't allowed before. I wanted to know how I looked, yes, but more urgently, I wanted to know who I was now that the hidden part of me had been made tangible, even if only briefly, in the small gesture of lipstick and touch. I tried to talk to friends about it, not in the language of sexuality or performance, but in the language of identity and disorientation. "I don't feel like myself," I said to one, fumbling for words. "Or maybe I feel like there's more of myself than I've let exist." They nodded politely, offered the usual reassurances, the clichés about everyone having multiple sides, and I realized I couldn't rely on their understanding. This was mine to navigate. No amount of explanation, no reassurance, could replace the moral and emotional labor I now owed to myself. By evening, I found myself drawn to the closet in our bedroom, where clothes I had never considered were folded or hanging in muted tones, fabrics that I had avoided but never discarded. It wasn't curiosity for curiosity's sake, it wasn't whimsical or performative, it was the need to explore, to inhabit the contours of possibility in a way that my life up to now hadn't permitted. I picked up a soft cardigan she had bought for herself years ago, a pale gray that smelled faintly of her shampoo, and felt the weight of it in my hands. I didn't wear it. I just held it, turning it over, letting the texture and memory settle inside me. When she returned from work, I had not prepared a conversation. Words felt impossible. Instead, I simply held her gaze over the kitchen counter while she set down her bag. There was a question in her expression, not about the lipstick, not about what I might try next, but about whether I had carried yesterday into today with honesty or deflection. I met it, uncomfortably but fully. And in that small acknowledgement, a new layer of trust emerged, one that didn't require theatrics or declarations, just presence and shared recognition. We ate in silence for a while. She sliced bread with the precision of habit, and I poured tea, noting the rhythm of her hands, the way she paused when the knife scraped the plate, the way the sun fell across the table. Every ordinary motion seemed magnified, charged with meaning, because the internal world I had been ignoring was now unavoidably active. I couldn't escape myself the way I used to. Every small gesture, every familiar corner of the apartment, was a mirror to choices I hadn't yet fully named. Later, she asked me what I wanted, what I was trying to explore. I hesitated. I wanted to say nothing, because that was safe. I wanted to say everything, because that was honest. Instead, I said, I want to understand who I am without pretending I'm only one thing. The words felt clumsy, but she nodded, and that nod felt like permission and caution wrapped together. It was the first time I recognized that identity isn't a single performance, and it isn't fixed. It's a negotiation, a slow dialogue with the self, and the people who witness it. That night, lying in bed, I realized that transformation wasn't about the lipstick, or the cardigan, or any external mark. It was about seeing the boundaries I had drawn for myself and deciding, consciously, which ones were necessary and which were imposed by fear. There was grief in that recognition, grief for the years I had spent hiding, for the silences and the small compromises, but also relief, because it meant that change wasn't happening to me, I was choosing to let it in. I drifted to sleep with the memory of her thumb under my chin, the brush poised in the air, the weight of both care and challenge pressing gently but insistently on me. I didn't know what the next weeks or months would bring. I didn't know what friends or family might say, or how my own self-conception might stretch or fracture. But I knew I had crossed a threshold, the threshold of honesty, of deliberate self-recognition, of moral and emotional engagement with who I really was. The rest would unfold slowly, in its own time, and I would have to be patient, vigilant, and honest with myself every step of the way. The weeks that followed blurred together at first, each day carrying the same quiet tension as the day before, but over time I realized they were not identical. They were accumulations of small decisions, small recognitions, like pebbles dropped into a pond, each ripple expanding in ways I could not predict. I tried to maintain the routines I had built for myself, but they felt increasingly hollow, the edges of habit fraying under the pressure of a self I was only beginning to notice. My mornings began with longer pauses in front of the mirror, not out of vanity, but out of necessity, as though the reflection demanded acknowledgement before I could leave it behind. Each time I saw myself, I asked the same question: which version of me am I responsible for today? The answer was never simple. I started keeping a journal, though I never called it that aloud. I wrote in scraps of time between meetings and errands, on the edges of grocery receipts and folded pieces of paper tucked into drawers I had long ignored. The act of putting words to thoughts that had previously been internalized as abstract unease was transformative in ways I could not have predicted. I wrote about fear, about guilt, about fleeting joy when I allowed myself the slightest indulgence in self-expression. I wrote about her, too, the way she watched, the way she waited, the way she offered space without pressing or directing. I began to understand that intimacy was not merely about touch or proximity, it was about recognition and consent and trust, and that understanding shaped every interaction I had with her and, later, with myself. The first time I dressed intentionally in clothes that were not my habitual uniform of dark, functional garments, I felt a peculiar mixture of vulnerability and exhilaration. I chose a blouse she had bought months ago, light in color, soft against my skin, paired with pants that were neutral but fit differently than what I had worn for years. Standing in the bedroom, I realized my reflection was neither stranger nor mimicry, it was an honest, unfamiliar self, a person I recognized but had never met. I felt a tremor of fear, not of judgment, not even of visibility, but of responsibility. Responsibility to maintain integrity, to honor the identity I was exploring without turning it into performance or escape. She noticed immediately. Not in words, words were rarely necessary, but in the soft way she leaned against the doorway, a mixture of curiosity and reassurance in her stance. I caught her gaze and saw understanding, but also the subtle caution that accompanies anyone witnessing someone else step into a part of themselves they have long suppressed. There was no laughter, no spectacle, no dramatic reveal. Just presence, and in that presence, the implicit contract that exploration carries consequences, ethical and emotional. I began to experiment gradually, testing the boundaries of my comfort and the expectations of others. Public spaces became arenas of quiet observation. Walking down the street in a blouse that softened my silhouette, I noticed the small ways people's eyes lingered or avoided, and I catalogued the subtle shifts in posture, tone, and attention. I realized that what I had feared, mockery, misunderstanding, was often less than what I had anticipated, though occasionally sharper. But more importantly, I noticed the responses inside myself: pride, shame, relief, apprehension, curiosity. The internal landscape was far more complicated than any outward reaction. At work, I did not announce any changes, yet they were visible in the minutiae: the way I carried my shoulders, the attentiveness to detail I had previously neglected, the conscious modulation of voice and gesture. I worried about perception, yes, but I also began to notice an unanticipated freedom and self-alignment. The act of integrating inner and outer identities quietly reshaped my moral compass. I felt a responsibility not to deceive, not to perform for approval, but to act consistently with the emerging self I had begun to inhabit. That consistency demanded reflection, honesty, and patience. There were difficult conversations, too. Friends who had known me for decades occasionally asked questions I struggled to answer without reducing the experience to novelty or humor. I learned to navigate these moments with as much clarity and grace as I could muster, articulating that this exploration was neither frivolous nor fleeting, but a careful, deliberate engagement with identity, ethics, and relational integrity. It was exhausting at times, emotionally taxing in ways that felt disproportionate, but it also forced me into intellectual and empathetic rigor I had avoided for years. Family interactions were even more complex. I realized that parents, siblings, cousins, people who had long known versions of me, needed evidence of sincerity, not spectacle. I began to anticipate the weight of their expectations and fears, balancing authenticity with responsibility, and in doing so, I discovered that moral accountability is rarely public. It exists in tiny moments: a choice of word, the restraint from defensiveness, the patient listening when assumptions are made. Each decision shaped not only how I was seen, but how I saw myself. The internal conflict intensified in private moments. Sometimes I would sit alone in the darkened living room, replaying incidents from the past, imagining alternative reactions, wondering if I had always been dishonest with myself. Occasionally, guilt surfaced, not for the exploration itself, but for the years of suppression, the emotional labor I had deferred onto others, including her. I realized that transformation carries both permission and obligation: permission to explore, obligation to be ethically present to the self and others affected by that exploration. There were moments of fleeting joy, too. Simple pleasures: a scarf draped just so, the soft brush of fabric against skin, the way light refracted differently in my eyes, became rich sensory markers of self-recognition. I learned to inhabit these small joys without shame, understanding that celebration of identity is not vanity, but acknowledgement. I began to feel empathy not only for myself, but for anyone who had ever concealed a part of themselves for fear, habit, or expectation. That empathy reshaped my ethical and social awareness in subtle, transformative ways. Through it all, our marriage adapted. Not seamlessly, not without tension, but organically. We began holding more deliberate conversations about boundaries, about observation, about shared and private experiences. I learned the importance of transparency, not as obligation, but as moral clarity: honesty about internal states, about experimentation, about uncertainty. In return, she offered patience, insight, and a mirror I could trust, which I began to understand as one of the rarest forms of moral and emotional support. I also realized that transformation is never a straight line. Setbacks occurred: days when old habits reasserted themselves, when fear or self-doubt overwhelmed curiosity, when I reverted to concealment. These setbacks were not failures, they were data, evidence of the work still required. I learned to meet them with reflection rather than shame, integrating them into a broader narrative of growth. Each return to honesty, each small act of courage, became a moral and emotional ledger, marking progress that was internal as much as visible. By the end of those months, I felt a quiet, persistent shift in my moral and psychological orientation. I was no longer merely responding to a catalyst, the thumb under my chin, the lipstick, the soft hand of recognition, but actively participating in my own becoming. Identity had ceased to be a fixed performance, it had become an ongoing negotiation between self-understanding, ethical responsibility, and relational awareness. I had learned, slowly, that transformation is not about spectacle or appearance, it is about integrity, empathy, and conscious engagement with the lives intersecting with your own. In that realization, I discovered the deepest lesson of all: visibility is not inherently liberation, but honesty is. Whether expressed through clothing, speech, or the minutiae of daily action, the act of aligning internal truth with external reality carries consequences, responsibilities, and, ultimately, a kind of freedom that cannot be taken lightly. The first time I ventured into a public space dressed in the ways I had been quietly exploring at home, I realized that the world outside had a vocabulary I had never learned. Not a vocabulary of clothes, exactly, or style, but a vocabulary of attention, expectation, and judgment. I walked down a familiar street near the park, the same route I had taken hundreds of times, but this time every step felt magnified. My shoes tapped differently on the pavement. The wind brushed against my skin in a way that seemed to comment on my presence. I noticed how people's gazes lingered just long enough to register surprise or recognition before moving on. I noticed my own reactions. A surge of pride followed immediately by the sharp, familiar stab of self-consciousness, followed in turn by the realization that none of this was inherently threatening. It was merely observation, both outward and inward. I remembered the night she held my chin, the night everything had shifted, and I realized that public perception was no longer the dominant force in my decision-making. That moment had taught me the first, hardest lesson: transformation begins with honesty, not approval. And yet, approval, or disapproval, was not irrelevant. It mattered because it revealed how I had previously ceded moral and emotional authority to external voices rather than cultivating it within myself. Work was the next frontier. I did not announce my explorations, I did not stage them. Instead, I integrated them subtly, consciously. A blouse, a scarf, a tilt of posture, a modulation of tone. I noticed that some colleagues reacted with curiosity, others with polite distance, and still others without registering at all. More striking than their reactions were my own, an internal calibration of confidence, a subtle negotiation of identity and perception. I realized that moral courage is rarely dramatic, it is quiet, ongoing, and cumulative. Each choice to inhabit myself honestly in public, however small, reinforced a pattern of integrity that I had never before experienced. Family gatherings became exercises in observation, patience, and dialogue. I noticed, over time, the ways old narratives had shaped our interactions, the unspoken expectations, the assumptions about temperament, the habitual silences that masked misunderstanding. I discovered that transformation is never solitary, it radiates outward, affecting every relational orbit. My parents noticed subtle differences in voice and posture, and at first they questioned them in ways that revealed discomfort more than judgment. Siblings asked fewer questions than I expected, but their glances carried curiosity tempered by caution. Cousins and friends offered smiles, compliments, or absent-minded recognition, and each of these small responses had weight because they demanded careful ethical navigation. I had to be present to their perception without turning it into a performance, acknowledging their reality while remaining faithful to my own. One afternoon, I visited a cafe I had frequented for years. A barista who had known me since college greeted me and paused, a subtle flicker across her expression that suggested recognition and slight uncertainty. I smiled and returned the greeting, conscious of the tension between acknowledgement and self-protection. I realized then that transformation is not about avoiding discomfort for oneself or others, it is about holding space for honest recognition, which often entails temporary unease. At home, the interplay of intimacy and self-expression deepened. We developed a rhythm, moments of deliberate dialogue, moments of silence, moments of shared observation. She would notice small changes I had made, how I arranged a scarf, how I carried my arms, and offer insight, never directive. I learned to listen actively, to separate advice from expectation, to receive feedback without letting it undermine autonomy. These were lessons in empathy as much as identity, seeing another fully without seeking to control, while remaining accountable to oneself. Social media presented its own challenges. I began experimenting with subtle self-expression online, not for visibility or validation, but to engage with a broader spectrum of experiences and perspectives. I discovered that each interaction, each like, comment, or omission, carried a latent ethical dimension. How could I remain authentic without being performative? How could I educate or enlighten without imposing? These questions reshaped my approach not only to identity but to social responsibility in digital spaces, revealing that transformation extends beyond private life into public moral engagement. There were setbacks. Some encounters triggered old habits of concealment. A careless remark from a friend, a misperceived glance from a stranger, a lingering worry about judgment from colleagues, each tested my commitment to honesty. I learned that accountability is iterative, that it requires constant recalibration. I also realized that self-compassion is integral, acknowledging mistakes, returning to intention, maintaining ethical consistency despite imperfection. Transformation is neither linear nor guaranteed, it demands patience, vigilance, and moral rigor. One of the most profound insights emerged during a conversation with her late one night. We were in the living room, the lamp casting a warm, narrow circle of light, and we discussed boundaries, what I could explore, what she could witness, what either of us needed to feel safe. I realized in that conversation that ethical engagement with identity requires explicit dialogue, not assumption. Trust is not inherent, it is co-constructed. Moral integrity extends beyond the self to the people whose lives intersect with yours, and it is fragile without transparency. By the end of this period, I noticed subtle internal shifts that were less visible externally but more consequential. Patience had grown where restlessness had once dominated. Empathy had deepened, not only for those who might misunderstand me, but for anyone struggling to inhabit their own truth within the constraints of expectation, fear, or habit. Responsibility had become a practice, a daily engagement with the self and others rather than a conceptual ideal. I recognized that transformation is not a singular event, it is a continuum, a sustained negotiation between desire, ethics, and reality. Even the small, intimate gestures carried new weight. A hand on the counter, a shared glance, a soft question in the kitchen, these became markers of moral and emotional literacy, evidence that identity cannot be disentangled from relationship. I learned to inhabit presence as an ethical stance, to act in ways that were honest, deliberate, and empathetic. Each choice mattered because it was public or private, conscious or habitual. Each ripple of action extended outward. In reflection, I realized that the journey I had begun with a drunken evening and a lipstick brush was far from superficial. It had opened doors to psychological, moral, and social dimensions I had never explored. I understood that the most meaningful transformations are internal first, a calibration of conscience, empathy, and relational awareness before any external change. Physical expression is secondary, and only effective when aligned with ethical and emotional rigor. By the time I fell asleep that night, I had learned something vital, that transformation is as much a moral practice as a personal one. Identity is a living dialogue between the self and the world. Visibility carries responsibility. Honesty carries risk. Empathy is labor. And above all, integrity is sustained through consistent reflection, choice, and action. Time began to bend differently after that first year. I realized I no longer measured life solely by milestones or routines, instead, I measured it by subtle shifts in perception, moments of internal negotiation, and the accumulation of ethical choices I had never consciously tracked before. The lipstick, the thumb under my chin, the soft nudges of recognition, those early moments had been catalysts, but the real work unfolded quietly, over months, in the rhythms of daily life, in the seemingly mundane interactions that carried disproportionate emotional weight. I remember standing in the hallway one afternoon, adjusting a scarf she had laid out for me, feeling the smooth fabric slide over my skin. I caught myself thinking not about how I looked but about how I felt, about authenticity, integrity, and the moral consequences of inhabiting a self I had long denied. The sensation was strange, liberation tethered to responsibility. I could not separate the joy of recognition from the vigilance of ethical engagement. It was as if every choice I made about self-expression became a node in a web of accountability, connecting me to her, to my family, to colleagues, to strangers, and ultimately to the self I was still learning to inhabit. I began to notice the ways my perception of others shifted. Conversations carried new weight. I listened differently, observed more attentively, weighed my words more carefully. empathy became not a fleeting impulse but a deliberate practice. I could see the internal lives of people I had once skimmed past, recognizing that everyone carried constraints, fears, and desires that were invisible unless one paused to observe. The act of confronting my own concealed identity sharpened my moral vision in ways I hadn't anticipated. Honesty toward oneself is inseparable from attention to others. Our marriage deepened in unexpected ways. We began to share not only experiences but processes, how we navigated perception, fear, and curiosity, how we translated internal understanding into ethical action. There were moments of tension, of course, disagreements over boundaries, misread intentions, moments where patience faltered, but these were instructive rather than destructive. I realized that relational integrity is not the absence of conflict but the willingness to confront it with honesty, empathy, and reflection. Each disagreement became a small laboratory for moral experimentation, teaching me about trust, responsibility, and shared agency. I also began documenting the experience more rigorously, not for public consumption, not for validation, but as a tool for understanding. I tracked patterns, moments when fear or shame overtook curiosity, instances when moral courage felt effortless, situations that demanded negotiation or compromise. Writing became a mirror, reflecting not just appearance or performance, but the inner architecture of choice, responsibility, and self-knowledge. I could see the trajectory of my own growth as clearly as I could see the trajectory of my reflection in a window pane. At work, I noticed the effects of sustained authenticity. Small changes in posture, tone, and expression began to influence perception. I was more attentive, more present, less reactive. Colleagues responded not merely to clothing or appearance, but to the consistency and integrity I carried in subtle ways. I realized that identity alignment affects not just the individual but the relational ecosystem surrounding them. By inhabiting myself authentically, I was, in small but significant ways, raising the standard for ethical engagement, communication, and emotional literacy in my immediate world. Family dynamics continued to evolve. Conversations that had once been perfunctory or avoided became opportunities for insight and mutual understanding. I learned to navigate curiosity without defensiveness, to provide information without insistence, to witness without judgment. My parents, initially cautious, began to recognize that my identity exploration was deliberate, ethical, and sustained, and over time their concerns softened into acceptance. Siblings became interlocutors in nuanced dialogue, sometimes challenging, sometimes supportive, but always part of the ongoing negotiation of trust and recognition. Public interactions became exercises in subtle courage. I discovered that simple acts, standing straighter, speaking clearly, making eye contact, became moral gestures as much as social ones. I understood that visibility, when intentional and aligned with internal truth, carries both risk and responsibility. Every encounter, no matter how mundane, became a test of moral integrity, to act authentically without coercion, to remain accountable, to model empathy through presence. There were setbacks. Old habits crept in during stressful periods. A minor confrontation at work, a careless remark from a friend, a fleeting desire to revert to concealment, each tested my commitment. But the difference now was awareness. I could recognize retreat as choice, analyze it without self-loathing, and reintegrate the lesson. The moral and psychological architecture I was constructing was resilient precisely because it acknowledged imperfection while demanding reflection and re-engagement. By the second year, I noticed a profound internal shift. Identity had ceased to be a static category or a set of external markers. It had become a continuous process of negotiation, reflection, and ethical engagement. I felt responsibility not only for how I presented myself but for how I moved through the world, the attentiveness I brought to conversations, the patience I practiced with misunderstanding, the quiet vigilance with which I nurtured trust. Transformation had become moral labor, psychological calibration, and relational commitment simultaneously. One evening, I found myself alone in the living room, tracing the edge of a soft blanket she had laid over the armrest. I reflected on the early days, the drunken evening, the thumb under my chin, the brush poised uncertainly, and realized that what had seemed accidental was, in retrospect, a moral and emotional turning point. That small act had catalyzed a trajectory of sustained reflection, accountability, and growth. It had been neither dramatic nor spectacular, yet its consequences had rippled outward, shaping my identity, relationships, and ethical understanding in ways I could not have imagined. I understood then that transformation is never about a single event. It is about accumulation, the ongoing alignment of self-perception, moral responsibility, and relational awareness. The lipstick, the clothes, the public interactions, these were secondary markers, reflections of a deeper process. What mattered most was the cultivation of integrity, the willingness to face discomfort, the commitment to honesty, the patient work of inhabiting oneself fully and ethically. By the end of Part 5, I recognized that I had entered a new rhythm of being. Identity was a dialogue, not a label. Visibility was a choice, not a condition. Ethics, empathy, and responsibility had become inseparable from self-expression. And above all, I had learned that the value of transformation lies not in spectacle or novelty, but in the deliberate, sustained labor of understanding, acknowledging, and inhabiting the self, and of doing so in ways that honor others who are inevitably affected by that self. Years had passed since that first evening, since the thumb under my chin and the brush poised against my lips, and I still remembered it with the clarity of a wound that had healed but left a faint scar, a permanent trace that I could feel if I pressed the right way. Life had not become simpler, but I had become more deliberate. The days were not easier, they never are, but I had learned to navigate complexity with attention, care, and a quiet moral discipline that had once been foreign to me. Transformation had ceased to be a curiosity, an experiment, or a private act of rebellion. It had become a framework for living, a constant, deliberate negotiation between internal truth, ethical responsibility, and relational integrity. I noticed it in subtle ways at home. A glance exchanged across the living room carried more meaning because it was layered with recognition and respect, not assumption. A hand laid on the counter, a voice modulated in conversation, a pause before responding, each gesture was informed by months and years of internal reflection and ethical calibration. She noticed, of course, but it was no longer necessary for her to prompt. The internal rhythm we had developed was self-sustaining, the product of shared trust and individual accountability. Friends and colleagues had gradually adjusted, though not without friction. Some never quite understood, and that was acceptable. Understanding cannot be demanded. Others offered insight, curiosity, and a subtle kind of companionship that only grows when authenticity is sustained. I learned that social perception is never fully controllable, yet one's ethical and emotional responsibility extends into these spheres. The lesson was that integrity is both internal and relational, and its consequences ripple outward in ways impossible to quantify. Family gatherings evolved similarly. Conversations that had once been tentative became deliberate exercises in mutual acknowledgement. I learned the importance of patience and empathy in these interactions, when to explain, when to listen, when to simply exist without justification. My parents, once cautious, now approached our interactions with quiet acceptance, siblings engaged with humor, curiosity, or concern, but always within a framework of recognition that had been painstakingly negotiated over time. Every relationship required work, not performative, but consistent, attentive, ethical work. I had discovered that relational moral labor is as critical as self-understanding in sustaining authentic identity. By this time, I had developed a vocabulary for internal reflection that carried over into daily life. I no longer needed to catalog every minor sensation or reaction in a journal, because the practice itself had become internalized. Awareness of fear, desire, curiosity, shame, pride, and moral responsibility was continuous, integrated into the simplest decisions: how to speak, how to dress, how to listen, how to move through a world that rarely aligns neatly with intention. I had learned that identity is never fixed, yet it is coherent when approached with deliberation and reflection. One particularly striking realization came during an unremarkable walk in the park. I noticed a young parent struggling with a stroller and a toddler simultaneously, their frustration and fatigue written plainly across their posture. I felt a surge of empathy I had never fully experienced before, not sympathy, not judgment, but deep recognition of shared vulnerability. It struck me then that this capacity for empathy was directly linked to the long months I had spent confronting my own vulnerability, my own fears and concealments. The moral and emotional labor I had invested in understanding myself had expanded outward, shaping not only my self-conception but my perception of others. Intimacy with my spouse deepened in ways subtle but profound. We had developed rituals of observation and dialogue, small, deliberate moments in which we noted changes in posture, tone, or expression, not to judge but to witness and support. Each conversation, each shared glance, reinforced a moral economy of care, the understanding that our lives intersected not just practically but ethically, that attention, patience, and integrity were as much acts of love as affection or touch. The domestic space, once mundane, had become a laboratory for moral and emotional practice. I began to understand fully that transformation is not a single event, it is a continuum, a process of sustained alignment between self-perception, ethical responsibility, and relational presence. The initial act of allowing her to hold my chin and paint my lips had been a threshold, but the true work lay in the cumulative practice that followed, the reflection, the dialogue, the attentiveness, the accountability, and the empathy that had developed incrementally over years. External markers, clothing, hairstyles, even the subtle ways others perceived me, had become secondary to the internal architecture I had constructed. I could inhabit myself authentically without needing validation, I could act ethically without expecting reward, I could feel empathy without anticipating reciprocation. The internal compass I had developed guided choices, calibrated responses, and shaped interactions with a consistency that felt almost revolutionary in contrast to my former life of habitual concealment. Public interactions had become exercises in mindfulness rather than performance. I understood now that visibility carries moral weight. Every gesture, every word, every act of self-expression has consequences beyond the individual. By inhabiting my identity ethically and deliberately, I contributed quietly to a culture of understanding, even if only in the smallest of ripples. Transformation, I realized, is inseparable from moral engagement. I also recognized that the process never truly ends. Identity evolves with experience, relationships, and context. There are moments of doubt, lapses in courage, and periods of fatigue, but these are opportunities for renewed reflection rather than failure. What matters is sustained attention, the willingness to inhabit oneself fully, ethically, and empathetically, and to carry the consequences of that inhabitation into every aspect of life. One quiet evening, sitting on the couch with her, I traced the familiar contours of our shared space, the soft light of a lamp, the subtle hum of the heater, the textures of blankets and clothing, and I realized that the journey had yielded something more profound than I had imagined. I had cultivated not only identity but moral and emotional literacy. I had learned that courage is quiet, empathy is laborious, and integrity is a practice as much as a state of being. I understood that transformation is not about spectacle or novelty, but about sustained, deliberate alignment of internal truth with ethical action and relational accountability. I could finally look back on the drunken evening, the thumb under my chin, the brush poised uncertainly, without shame, without fear, without nostalgia for an incomplete self. That moment had been a catalyst, yes, but the significance lay not in what was done to me or for me, but in what I had chosen to cultivate afterward. Transformation had become a moral and emotional discipline, a relational practice, and a path to deeper empathy, for myself, for others, and for the intricate, fragile, and often unseen fabric of human experience. In the end, I realized that identity is not a destination but a continuous conversation, with oneself, with others, and with the world. Each choice, each gesture, each act of honesty matters. Empathy is a practice. Courage is sustained attention. Integrity is the labor that underlies authenticity. And the faint scar left by that first brush of color is not a wound, but a reminder that transformation is possible, not through spectacle or chance, but through deliberate, ethical, and empathetic engagement with the self and all those whose lives intersect with it. And so, in that quiet moment, I understood the deepest truth of all: the act of becoming oneself is inseparable from the act of honoring others. To inhabit identity fully is to inhabit the moral and emotional responsibilities it entails. That is the work, the lesson, and the enduring meaning of everything that began with a thumb under a chin and a brush poised in gentle, deliberate recognition.